Hello, welcome to the Data Storyteller. My name is Joe. Today we're going to be looking at something that's happened really recently here over in the UK, and that is the general election. More specifically, from the point of this video, is kind of like looking at what has been put online and out there in terms of communicating data from the results. I'm going to have a quick look at that and show what a couple of websites have done, those being specifically BBC and Channel 4. So first of all, I'm just going to jump right in because that's what we want to do. So as many of you know, hopefully already, so there was a Conservative majority and they got a considerable amount of seats, 365 comparative to Labour's 203. And I suppose this is the first kind of graph that we've got here, is this kind of basic understanding with this kind of like line, a dotted line going across here to show how many seats were needed to win. Very simple. This is just quite superficial what I'm looking at here. I think the next part is going to go into a lot more detail, and you can kind of see how data is projected and how it can be used, and also how it could be perceived in different ways by different people. So quite interesting. And I absolutely love what the BBC have done in terms of presenting the data. They've done a good job for a couple of years now. But this is kind of something that moves on and on. It's quite iterative and improves constantly. So first of all is this map that shows the results of the 2019 election. And as you can see, there is a swathe of blue across the country with kind of more built up city areas showing a bit more red here. This in itself is kind of the first interesting interpretation, because if we click on 2017 results, you'll see that this kind of northern boundary here is now full of red compared to what's just happened. So those northern strongholds that were occupied originally in red, see here in 2017, have now gone to blue in quite a few instances. And this kind of intermediary here, this kind of changes, just highlights that a bit further. As you can see, it's quite a lot in this northern belt. And of course, not forgetting those gains by the Scottish National Party also in Scotland, who have, I think, took a few away from Labour and Conservative in Scotland. There's some big changes there. Also, there's a Lib Dem win seat there. But I think the most interesting part of this, and I think this goes back to how data is actually perceived and presented to people and their understanding of it, is when we take this to what's called a cartogram. So what it does is it's taking the UK's 650 parliamentary seats, and it says as if they're hexagons of the same size. Now what's presented in the map just in front of you right now is actually just based on geographical size and actually the geographical output of the UK. But if we change this right now to the cartogram, and this is quite interesting. So that then you might think, just looking at it from purely this perspective, that actually, although maybe slightly less, Labour have actually got nearer the amount of seats than you do see in, going back to the results this time, this option. And perceptions of data is just quite interesting from this perspective. And again, as you can see up in Scotland, you've got that strong, that yellow, that SNP kind of area. So that's quite interesting. And again, if we do that a comparison between the 2017 results, you can see very, very clearly this kind of northern belt that's since been dropped to some degree. Albeit it's not as extreme as it is on the purely geographical size version rather than these hexagons. Okay, so that's just one example. I think that's a fantastic example of how the BBC has presented data, communicated it in a way that a lot of people can understand. They also do this quite a lot a bit further below in terms of showing on this kind of horizontal, or vertical rather, kind of movement with a horizontal kind of Labour lost votes in Leave and Remain areas. The next kind of graph I'm going to look at in terms of communicating data relates to the number of women MPs elected continues to rise. I would have presented this personally more of a line graph because in some ways it's hard to figure out a baseline, albeit for the Labour. So it's more difficult to assess it for the other parties in this instance. But I think it'd be a bit better if that was on a line graph. But albeit it's quite interesting to see, and the obvious trend is upwards in terms of the number of women MPs. And this next one here is also quite interesting. So we look at turnout in the most recent elections. You can see these three bars here all relate to how many instances we've had important votes over the last few years rather. They're all bunched up together, whereas these are a bit spaced out, as is, I think it's 5 years that's traditionally the time between each new election, general election rather. And we can see here that voter turnout's dropped just slightly. So those that did the analysis on this, thank you very much. I'm just commenting on it, but I'll link them all in the description. Moving on, the BBC again have produced a fantastic kind of animated tour of the general election in 10 stops, and I'll run you through it because it's very, very cool if you're into that kind of thing, but just shows how presenting the data in this kind of format can also be understood by a lot of people. So, scroll to find out how the UK voted. Right, so we've outlined here how the Conservatives 365 seats, Labour 203, SNP 48, and that's visualised again by these little circles. So we scroll up, that then places those circles. So it tells kind of like the story as we go along, a bit of the narrative. And again, this channel's trying to focus a bit on kind of how data can be presented as a story through narrative and what picture that can build up. So say, in this instance, the Conservatives won 365 seats, giving Boris Johnson a majority of 80. Their 44% share of the vote was the highest since Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979. So how did this happen? So there, straight off the bat, you've got a nice question that leads you in to finding out a bit more, or wanting to find out a bit more. And this happened, I was actually watching it myself, so right at the start of the night, it says, something unusual had happened. The third seat to declare, in this instance called Blythe Valley, had been Labour for nearly 70 years and was predicted to stay that way, and Labour lost there by, albeit very close, 712 votes. And I think that put the kind of like track on for the rest of the election. So the next step, and again it's mentioning story here, which is quite cool. So this story was repeated again and again as Labour's red wall, so that was kind of like that northern thing I mentioned a bit earlier, in the north crumbled. Labour's vote share reduced by 13% in the northeast and 10% in Yorkshire and Humber. Many of these seats voted strongly to leave the EU. Some people are calling this very much a Brexit election. This is not a political fueled video, I'm just making comments on what's been said out there. We go into a bit more detail now, so kind of like they're going in and then they're coming back out and they're going in and focusing on a bit more of the detail. So in this instance, then they're looking at Wakefield, which had been Labour since 1932, and the Tories won by a huge majority in this instance, 3,000. Another good way of presenting what they've done here is through kind of like the bar chart or horizontal bar chart. Now having a look around the rest of the country, looking at Wales. And again, it kind of follows like a good narrative to show a little movement. We're down in the southwest now, looking from a Lib Dems perspective. This is also one of the talking points. Joe Swinson, who was the Liberal Democrat leader, just lost in Eastern Bartonshire in Scotland. And we're going a bit more focus on Scotland in general. I quite like how the animation, again, as I say, moves out and kind of focuses on these regional areas at the same time as going into that detail. over to Northern Ireland now, and again that tells its own story. And now we'll focus finally on London, and there's a bit of detail in that area. Okay, and then the animation pulls back out and you can go in to read more information. So I think that's a really good example of communicating information, or data rather, in a way that could be easily followed, is interesting, and it kind of follows a narrative. So the next area we're going to look at is it's from Channel 4, and it says the 2019 general election explained in 5 graphs by Georgina Lee. So Georgina Lee, thank you very much for producing this. This tells it in a slightly different format to what the BBC had done, but it's got some headline facts. So in this instance, fewest Labour seats since 1935, and they've marked this out clearly on a proper bar chart. As you can see, there's peaks and troughs, but in this instance, so this is one of the lowest for many, many years. Good way of presenting data. Good way of communicating it. You'll see that they've kind of made almost like a velvety colour compared to like the pinky for the rest of the kind of a pinky colour for past elections, just to highlight in bold almost what the important data points are for this election. And then again, they're using that kind of title. In this instance, it's a line chart to show kind of the share of the votes. And a bit more kind of narrative to the background, so it's not bad historically, in this sense from a Labour's perspective. That's just another good way of showing the data, and they've actually outlined the individual points here on a line graph. Modest share gains for the Conservatives, major losses for Labour. I won't go into too much detail, but you can just see by presenting things in a very clearly structured kind of bar chart kind of way, you can start to build a picture from the data. You can actually start to build your own story, your own narrative. Just scrolling through a couple here. I think that's mostly it. Looking at vote share versus seat share, 2019. It's just some interesting things. So I suppose that was just a brief kind of like overview of a couple of examples of how data can be presented to people. And in this instance, I wrote a couple of notes down. I suppose the audience in this example is quite wide-ranging. It could be a lot of people who don't necessarily follow politics generally. So presenting that to anyone who can understand, from I suppose children up to the elderly and and anyone in between, is very important. So I think both kind of like did a good job of that. BBC in particular did a very good job of that. The narratives, I suppose the narratives from the BBC's animation told a very good story. Channel 4's kind of fact check article here painted it in very much a graphical point of view, rather than going through that kind of animation and mapping side of things, which is quite interesting. I suppose it would be interesting to see how it is presented, where this is just kind of like desktop view, how it's presented on mobiles, iOS, Android, etc., and what that would mean and how that's shown to us. I suppose what I've omitted from this one so far is actually kind of like the demographics data for people who voted. That would have been interesting to see. It's probably out there, I think it probably is, but I don't know how they would present that. So that's kind of like a very quick reaction to some of the data that's been communicated since the end of the general election here in the UK, 2019. I've linked all the sources and websites in the description, so you can see there. Thank you for those who've actually made it. I think Georgina Lee I've already mentioned, but those on the BBC, I'll put all their names in there as well. So hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye.